to be presenting on this anniversary together with Freek for the US AVD user group. And we'll probably just still call it WVD every now and then, because we are we grew accustomed to that, but we'll try to make sure that we get it right in the presentation. So my name is Esther Barthel, for those of you who do not know me yet. I've been active in the end user computing community for quite some time now, a lot of years already down the belt, and started with Citrix infrastructures, moved on to mostly focusing on automated deployments, automated configurations, and transitioning to the cloud with AVD and Azure DevOps at the moment. And I'm very honored to be presenting once again with Freek. Do you want to introduce yourself, Freek? Do you want me to tell the world how great you are? Or
let me do a quick introduction. So my name is Freek Berson, from the Netherlands as well. I primarily focus on application and desktop delivery technologies, so like Azure Virtual Desktop, WD before, but also long history in the RDS and terminal server space. I have been a Microsoft MVP on this topic as well for many years, and also enjoy working with automation in general and also infra code more specifically. So I've been doing ARM templates for many years as well. Struggled with those. We'll talk about that in just a second as well. And took a deep dive into Bicep about a year ago when it was announced. So yeah, happy to be here to share this and other topics with Esther today in this session. And this is actually not the first time Esther and I are presenting. Esther was already hinting that this is, I think, our 9th or 10th edition of this and other topics we presented over the last, what is it, almost 8-9 months or something like that.
Yeah, it's grown fast. Yeah, it's definitely.
It's almost our 1-year anniversary, Esther.
We definitely need to note that down. Yes.
Yeah. So, and actually, I created this slide a couple of sessions back, sort of as a joke. It started, and Esther said, "Well, this is great, you know, doing a roadshow together, but this was not really what I had in mind when I was thinking about a van and doing a roadshow together." So, Esther, I think you have a slide on what you thought the van should look like from the inside, at least.
Yes, because I figured, okay, I do understand that you want to be a bit anonymous when we're driving around the country with our roadshow van, but I definitely demanded to be able to decorate the inside. And I thought this was kind of a nice start to have some fun. And even though I know we're still battling COVID, I think we are at some countries already allowed to interact a bit more. I do understand the minions are not very good at keeping that 6 feet distance from each other, but I still think we can have a lot of fun in, well, what looks like a bit more luxurious than the exterior of the van that Freek proposed. But enough about the road shows and our personal preferences. I think I was going to say this evening, but for you guys it's lunch. So this afternoon lunchtime, we're going to focus on Azure Resource Manager and the coolness that Bicep offers. If we're talking about infrastructure as code and automated deployments within Azure. So as you can see, we have a lot of cool topics prepared for you. And I guess the key word in this is demos. So definitely gonna speed through the first slides just to get to the coolness and show you the power of Bicep itself. But before we dive into Bicep, we definitely wanted to make sure that you understand that it all started with Azure Resource Manager. And as you can see, Azure Resource Manager really is, let me get a laser pointer ready, really is the heart of Azure. And This is where you can automate and communicate with the resource manager to make sure that all those resources are created in Azure as you have defined them. Most of you will probably, or at least start it out with the Azure portal, which is the graphical user interface that Microsoft provides to create all your resources. And some of us have probably already experience with the CLI and PowerShell to already start working on automated deployments. And of course, there's also the SDKs and REST API, which has become a bit more of my personal favorite. But as you can see, these are still entry points basically to communicate with the ARM resource providers. That ensures that ARM can communicate with the underlying layer, the hardware itself, and the different controllers and managers that provide you the resources as they are created within Azure. So we wanted to make sure that you had an idea of where it all started. And well, I wanted to talk about all the coolness that ARM templates are and how many resources and documentations you can find to make it very easy for you to build your own ARM templates. But if I'm really honest about my personal experience, I have to admit that it hasn't always been a huge party and a breeze, so to speak. So this has been a screen that I've seen every now and then when I even try to just make tiny adjustments to the downloaded templates from the Azure portal itself. And this usually is the moment where I get back my mobile phone, hit that speed dial button, and basically tell Freek that I guess I made an error somewhere in my ARM templates. And if he had just a little bit of time to help me troubleshoot and break down where the error might have occurred. In this case, it wasn't DNS, trust me. It was networking, but that's a whole different topic. So my experience when I'm diving into doing some troubleshooting or trying to understand the ARM template and how it is built has been that it's not a breeze. There are a lot of different sections and especially a lot of different references that aren't always clear. So for me personally, dealing or troubleshooting ARM templates itself usually means that I'm scrolling up and down, trying to figure out which resource reference was mentioned in the variables or which parameter was actually used within it. And that's just talking about the basic stuff in the ARM templates. And then I'm not even going to go into linked templates. That means that you also need to check external references to other templates, other repositories that might not always be in your control. The good news is Microsoft has full understanding or fully understands that this is not the easiest, especially for those of us that are still having to make their first steps or getting acquainted with ARM templates. And to make sure that our life can be easier, they basically created Project Bicep. For those of you who already are experienced, just take a deep breath for a moment, and I'm just going to make sure that everyone understands what Bicep is and deal with some of the definitions first. So I'm not going to read everything out, but I want you to understand that Bicep is a domain-specific language or a DSL, and that means that it's a declarative language. Declarative meaning that you just basically state in a file what you want to be created and not how it needs to be created. So that makes life a lot easier. And the other cool thing, or at least that's where I get excited about Bicep, is that it's very intuitive. So it's, at least for me, felt like an easy learning experience to create my first Bicep files and my first templates and even do the deployments. And I'll show you in a minute just how easy it is made for us. Once again, making sure that you understand that the intention of Microsoft is not to use Bicep as a replacement for ARM templates. It's merely used as an additional tooling to make it easier for you to either create your ARM templates or to create automated deployments using Bicep templates instead of your ARM templates. But the main goal basically is that Bicep is your entry point, and we're still gonna go through the normal flow of an ARM template being created either by yourself with the transpiling is the right word, Freek? Yes.
Yes, transpiling.
Notes the last time. Transpiling your Bicep template into an ARM template and then doing your deployment based on that transpiled ARM template, or what we will show later on, use your Bicep template directly to have it basically translated in the background by the tooling that we are able to use. So the Azure Resource Manager still gets the ARM templates, which is the syntax and language that it knows and it understands to create your resources. It is just an extra tooling that will make it very easy for us to create ARM templates. Yeah. And I think I kind of explained it quite nicely.
You did.
Okay, cool. Because I'm really excited that today it's not just going to be Freek that's doing the demos. I'm nervous as hell. It's going to be me. Basically, what I told Freek is that, well, at first I felt very nervous showing the demos, and especially with Freek having so much knowledge, it felt a bit intimidating to do the demos and just see him not approvingly and wonder if he already was thinking about the improvements that we could make in the scripts. But I'm very fortunate that today he has, no, I have enough faith in myself that I can do the demos. So getting into demo time. Oh, hang on. Going way too fast. So first of all, let's have a look at creating your Bicep files. So for all of us that want to get started with Bicep, first of all, I think we kind of lost a slide here that explains the prerequisites.
The installation, yeah, you missed that. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So to quickly tell you what I did is you can easily download the executable bicep.exe from GitHub or the Microsoft download pages and install that or copy that to a local folder on your system. The only thing that you need to make sure is that you have the folder path to your Bicep executable in your path environment variable, because that ensures that whenever you want to call a Bicep build or a Bicep action, that it will definitely be performed and not you do not have to specify the full path. That will make it easier. Also for toolings like the Azure CLI or PowerShell that want to use your Bicep your local Bicep installation, to always find the file. Just Windows basics. The other thing that is really cool is if you're using VS Code, and it's not mandatory, it's more optional, but if you're using VS Code, there is an extension that you can install called Bicep Language Support. And this is where the coolness really happens, because now we are able to use some intelligence We're able to use, I learned a lot of cool words. We're able to use the linter function to make sure that the syntax of my code is correct. And it's even helping me by suggesting some fixes if I go wrong. And I will show you in a second. So those are just two of the cool things that you can do. And then all we have to do is get started. So I already created a blank hello world.bicep file. So .bicep is the file extension that makes sure that VS Code knows that it needs to use that language support extension. And I already did a quick bicep build. And I know it is an empty file, but I've seen Freek do this, so I wanted to do it too. So that will ensure that it creates the hello world JSON ARM template. So that's already the transpiling process. Easy as that. But there's more coolness. So one of the things that I really love is with Bicep that you get so much advice, so much from the IntelliSense that makes it easy to quickly create an ARM template. So first of all, of course, we're going to focus on the resources. In my case, I wanted to start, I don't know why, with a storage account. Just teasing Freek a little. But he suggested to get started with a host pool. So I'm just going to give my resource a name or a reference name, so to speak. And then, of course, we need to look for the AVD host pools. Easy as that. And it even already knows that I also need to specify a specific version. And instead of having to figure out what the available versions are or what the syntax is, it's already suggesting the list of available and selectable versions. So I can easily just select that version. Let me just move this one. No. Just forget it. And then I can easily just say, start with the definition of the file. And as you can see, there's also something called scaffolding, which is a totally new word for me, but I figured it out. Because that means that Bicep, the language support, already knows what the required properties are, for instance, for my host pool. And I can easily and it already suggests or asks me, what do you want to do? Do you want to do like complex stuff with for loops or if statements? And I basically told it already, that's more for Freek and not right now for me. But it did offer me some help with the required properties. And let me just quickly slide back. Just moving that one out of the way. Because this makes it better visible. So now I only have to specify a host pool name. Let's call it Bicep pool. I have to specify a host pool type. And if I press Control Space, which is my new friend today, I can even get suggestions of the available options or properties that I can specify. So host pool type, there are 3 different definitions that I can use. So in my case, I'm just going to use pooled, do the same trick for the load balancer type, say breadth first, and then the preferred application group. Let's do desktop. Easy as that. I already created my Bicep template to create a host pool in Azure. Oh, trying to mess it up. So all I have to do is run that build again on my Hello World Bicep. And now I'll probably have to find my Hello World JSON, open it to the site. because this is the cool part where I, for once, get to say, look, there's only 8 lines of code in here and 24 already on the other side. And for me personally, it just felt really easy to create my first Bicep file. So, and as you can see, it translated that resource correctly into all the definitions. It just needs a bit more of lines, like I usually need a bit more of words to explain what I'm trying to do. So I hope that already gives you a first impression of why I, for instance, am excited about using Bicep. Another thing, of course, with the ARM templates is that we usually use parameters. So what if, for instance, I want to create a parameter that says prefix, so I can easily create prefixes. It already tells me what type of parameters I can specify. In my case, it's a string, and I can also give it a default value. Bicep. So easy, and for me, it was just a couple of seconds typing, and I already have a parameter as well. Going over the squirrely lines beneath prefix, I already get some tips and suggestions from the Bicep language support that basically states that it's pretty cool that I created a parameter, but I didn't use it anywhere. So I might just try to consider using it, which I think is pretty smart. So let's just quickly do a reference to the prefix. And this is the special reference to use it within a string. But I could just as easily create a parameter. And I'm just quickly going to copy some code because otherwise it's going to take us a long time with these. Because there is something called declarators as well. Decorators. And that allows me to specify those pre-select options for my parameters. And that makes it even easier, for instance, to use a parameter for the host pool type. And instead of just having pooled here, it can now be an input for my template. Same with the load balancer type. And the cool part is that now I don't need the $sign and the special notation to use this parameter. I can just use it by name and reference it. So that's already making life a lot easier. We all know parameters are the input types for the variables that we know from the ARM template. There is also an equivalent for Bicep. So I can just easily create desktop, in this case, trying to multitask, and just make sure that within my template, I can reference this application group type multiple times by just referencing the variable and easily change it if it needs to be changed. I'm hoping that this already gives you a cool impression of all the possibilities that we can do with Bicep. One final thing, because I fully understand if, for instance, you are not entirely sure what the syntax is, or if you have are providing enough information to Azure Resource Manager with only those required properties. So the other thing that Bicep has is called snippets. And they allow you basically to have already pre-configured code. And we can reference the snippets for resources with res minus, and then we can easily scroll through them, or for instance, just type in the word. And in this case, it already gives me a snippet of code as we are used in PowerShell. And with the tab, I can easily tab to the different configurable settings and quickly change those settings for me. And basically, I think that's the first part. This is like the one-on-one course for Bicep.
It's not one-on-one. This is definitely. I mean, these features have not been available since a couple of releases back of Bicep, of course. So even with Bicep, we had some struggles creating resources from scratch, going into the docs documentation, like you said, figuring out which are the properties which are mandatory exactly and which we should use. But these scaffolding and snippets, these are super helpful, like you're showing, creating resources just a matter of seconds. So really cool.
Yeah. And I have to admit, Freek, that I didn't always have you on speed dial, so I had to find another way to make sure that I could use your experience and knowledge already. So I'm just gonna bluntly take this opportunity to explain to everyone that I did have some help building my first code. So maybe, Freek, maybe we can help someone in this session as well. So what do you say? Do you think we will probably have enough time for me to do some searching for a cool question that we don't have the answer right now, but definitely feel the pressure to deliver an answer within the 1 hour session that we have?
Let's do that. Yeah, let's actually give away a physical copy to the one who comes up with the answer. So if you can search for an awesome question, that'll be great. Happy to hand out a physical copy to the winner for sure.
Okay, well, with that already arranged, I'm just gonna hand it over to you, Freek, and dazzle our audience a bit more with all the cool features that Bicep has.
I'll try.
No pressure.
So let me know if you can all see my screen. Showing up?
Yes.
Cool. So that was a great introduction, like Esther said, and getting started with Bicep with all of the stuff around the VS Code editor with the language support, with the scaffolding, the code completion, etc. Definitely helpful if you start building these templates from scratch as well. We also want to address a couple of other cool features about the language that have been recently introduced as well. So first thing is we're going to take a look at deploying multiple resources at the same time. So Esther showed a single resource going into a single resource group, but a lot of times you'll probably deal with multiple resources you want to deploy, and even deploying those into multiple resource groups. So we have an example here, and the virtual machine seems like the perfect example to show you that. This is an existing Bicep template. Similar to Esther, we have a couple of parameters with some default values in there as well, allowing us to customize this Bicep template once we are deploying and running it. And we are creating 3 different resources as part of this Bicep template. So we are creating a virtual network, a network adapter, as well as a virtual machine. So you might be aware, probably all aware, that once you create a virtual machine in Azure, there are multiple resources that have to deal with a virtual machine. You have the virtual machine itself, the network adapter, the managed disk, etc. So you, as the deployer of these templates, need to tell the ARM engine what is the order in which we need to deploy these resources to make sure that the dependencies are set correctly. So similar to what Esther did, well, just Bicep built this into an ARM template using the command right here. And let's open it up side by side to see some of the comparisons between these 2 templates. And again, like Esther also mentioned, notice the difference in the readability of the left-hand side and right-hand side. You probably all have, I've seen that it's much more easier to read and author and debug the left-hand side in this case. But let me scroll down to the multiple resources that we are talking about in this case. So this is the JSON equivalent of creating a network interface. So stating the type, the version, the name, location, etc. And notice that there is a depends on section here. So this is us telling the ARM engine before creating this network interface, make sure that this virtual network already exists. So either pre-created or created inside this template. So this is us telling the ARM engine to make those dependencies in there. So on the left-hand side, on the Bicep side, there is no depends on section there. So how did it end up in there using that magical transpilation process? And the idea is that because we are referencing a property of a previously declared object, so for example, you have the subnet declaration here, the ID, we are gathering, we're pointing to the VNet, which is a resource that we created above in this template, and we're getting the ID of that VNet. Now, because we're referencing a property of a previously declared object, the transpilation process knows to implicitly end that depends on section to the ARM template for us. So we don't have to worry about all those dependencies anymore. In this case, it's a super simple example with two types and one of them being dependent on the other. But you can imagine that if you have dozens of resources, and I've been in that situation where that depends on list grows and grows and grows, it's super hard to maintain and to make sure that it is correct, and it's now being done for us automatically. So that's one thing I wanted to show you in regards to deploying multiple resources. And the second thing is deploying multiple resources into multiple resource groups also, and taking a look at the modularity approach of Bicep as well. In order to do that, I have another example here, example number 9, which consists of multiple files. So I have a main.bicep file, which is, well, as the name implies, our main file that we're going to deploy. And as you can see, I have a couple of other Bicep files, and these are my modules. So I'll take a look at those in just a second as well. So inside this Bicep file, we actually changed the target scope. So by default, if you have been doing ARM template deployments before, you probably know that if you are doing a ARM template deployment by default, and that applies to a Bicep as well, the default scope is to a resource group. So by default, all of the resources you deploy end up in a single resource group. That's of course not what you want. If you want to separate out into different resource groups that have different lifetimes or different purposes, etc., you need to change that into a target scope of subscription. Next, we are creating a couple of parameters. We've seen those before, the decorators that Esther talked about as well. This is one is called secure, which allows me to mark this parameter as secure so that it doesn't end up in any log file or other log file in the Azure portal as well. And I have created a special parameter here, which is an array. So this actually contains 2 different instances of an Azure Virtual Desktop backplane, one for full desktop and one for real applications or remote app. So this is an array of 2 different objects that we're going to be using to deploy 2 different Azure Virtual Desktop deployments, one for full desktop and one for remote app. So before we take a look at that module, there's one more thing I also want to show you, and that is conditional deployments. So sometimes you might want to deploy a resource only if a specific condition is met. And that's exactly what we're doing right here. So we're declaring a resource, which is a resource group, as you can see at the type, by simply adding an equal sign followed by if deployment resource group. This resource, in this case, resource group, will only be deployed if this, in this case, a Boolean is set to true. So this allows me to modify the deployment upon deployment time and actually decide whether or not I want to create this object based on a parameter. So that's the conditional concept. So moving on to the modules, I mentioned that we have this parameter here for the Azure Virtual Desktop backplane. But we're also using other modules, the one that we'll have on the left-hand side as well. So instead of using the resource keyword, we're actually using the module keyword, which seems quite obvious to do. We have that symbolic name, and this time we are referring to another file. So that means that we're using the resources that are declared in this file, get them into this main, and also deploy them as part of this deployment as well. Next thing we can do is we can configure a scope. So in this case, we are configuring that all of the resources that are defined inside this module are going to be deployed inside the RG resource group, which is a resource that we have created and declared before. We have a name and we have a couple of parameters. So basically, here we are passing a couple of parameters that we collected in this main file and passing them towards the VNet, in this case, module. Another cool thing.
So these are parameters for the module that you specified in the module file. So these are not parameters as we know for ARM templates that I showed previously.
Yeah, and the fun thing about that is that we're pointing to a Bicep file here, which has the name module. But if you take a look at the file inside, what's inside that file, this is just another Bicep file. So there's absolutely no difference between a module file and a Bicep file. I could just transpile this into a JSON file, feed it into the ARM engine, and have it deployed. But because it's a .bicep file, I can use it as a module for other projects, other deployments, etc. But other than that, like you said, these are just parameters, right? So there's nothing different about another Bicep file. These are just parameters that this Bicep file has. And instead of using this Bicep file, we are calling it from the main file and passing it a couple of parameters that are at least required by that. Another cool thing about the modules is that we can use it in combination with looping as well. And looping allows us to declare resources, declare instances of a resource multiple times without having to declare them multiple times by using what's called a for loop. And this is where we use that for loop. So again, we have the keyword module, followed by the symbolic name, followed by the file, which contains the declarations of our Azure Virtual Desktop deployments, so host pools, application groups, etc. And in this case, we are telling the ARM engine not to deploy it once, but deploy it multiple times by saying for every AVD backplane, as configured in the AVD backplanes with an S, actually deploy this. So going back to the array here, this is going to deploy twice, right? Once for full desktop and one for remote app. So that's the way you can use a for loop in combination with modules as well, which is super powerful if you're creating multiple instances of the same resource. Similar to that, we also have another for loop I want to show you, which is a little bit different, but I think evenly powerful, is using the range for loop. So in this case, we're taking a look at the VM module, which obviously creates a couple of virtual machines. So again, we are collecting a couple of parameters, including one which is called number of virtual machines, which has a default value of 5, which we can override, of course, during deployment time. So upon the creation of the resource, we use the for loop for I in range 1 to number of virtual machines. So you probably guessed that this is going to deploy 5 virtual machines. And I, the value I, is then going to be available inside this resource declaration, and we can also reuse that. So in this case, like Esther also showed, the concatenation of different values, we're using that I to make the name of the NIC of the network adapter, in this case, unique. So the name is going to be vNIC -1, -2, -3, etc. So that's another for loop you can use to create multiple instances of a resource. Similarly, I'm doing the exact same thing for the virtual machine object as well. So also deploying 5 virtual machines and concatenating the name with the prefix followed by the integer I. So that's 2 examples of using for loops.
Yes, and I guess this VM resource references the VNet that is created above. So that has to depend on implicitly defined.
Yes, and it's good that you mentioned that, because that's one thing I wanted to show you about that reference, because here, like you mentioned, this is that exact reference towards a property of a previously declared object. So the VNet is, or at least seems to be declared here, but something different about this declaration, because we're not creating the VNet here. We're just saying that there is a VNet by using the existing keyword and only providing it the name of that VNet. So this allows us to reference a resource that is already created, maybe by someone else, maybe by a different Bicep file, or maybe already existing in the Azure portal, and still allowing us to use that dot property access to provide the access to the property of a previously declared object. So it's good that you mentioned that, because I was on my way of forgetting about the dimension of the existing keyword, which is super powerful, because it does allow you to refer to objects that were created outside of your Bicep file or outside of your deployment.
Yes, so that even makes it easier if you have different teams that focus on different resource types within Azure, to have them maintain their own Bicep files, but still know that you can use, for instance, the VNet settings.
Yep, exactly. Yep. Okay, that was the existing keyword. And what I also wanted to show you that sometimes, especially if you start adding more files, more modules, more complexity, sometimes you want to just get a visualization of what the deployment is going to be looking like. And that's something that they added to the VS Code extension as well, which is called the Bicep Visualizer. So upper right here, we have the option to open the visualizer for this Bicep file, or we can right-click the Bicep file and say open the visualizer as well. In this case, I want to open it up side by side to also see some cool features in there. So right-hand side now has a visualization of what my deployment will look like. And as you can see, it can also adapt to whether or not it's inside a module or not. So this is the module icon, and these are all of my resources that I'm about to deploy. This is also interactive, so I can just change this to the way I want to see it and actually document it the way. So this is really helpful either when you are documenting your templates for your documentation purposes, or if you want to just get an overview of what you're going to deploy in a graphical interface. Super helpful to do that using the Bicep visualizer. And this is actually not only interactive, but also auto-updating. So for example, if I would create an additional resource group here, just by copying, in this case, the resource declaration, you can see on the left-hand side that it starts to add that resource, even without me saving this Bicep file. Here's that Azure resource group to the diagram in order to get that visualization update.
Nice.
And what's also cool is that if I accidentally make an error, for example, if I would go back to one of my modules, let's say the Azure Virtual Desktop module, going into the resource declaration of the workspace, if I would accidentally make a typo here, you can see that the visualizer, let me just zoom that in, says there's one error with the file, and it's also highlighting the module where the error actually occurred. So not only for documentation purposes, but you can have this maybe on a second screen somewhere, just following the creation of your resources while you are creating them in your Bicep file. So super helpful, I think, for documenting as well as getting an overview of what you are actually creating.
And for keeping some focus if you're trying to multitask too much.
Yes. Yeah, I really like the auto updating feature. I'm still waiting for the feature to actually export this to a PDF or a JPEG or something like that. That's not in there as well. I know it's on the roadmap to have that. It'll probably end up somewhere in the context menu to also save it as an export for your documentation. Okay. One more thing I want to show you in this case, and that's also decompiling. So why is that interesting? Maybe you have an ARM template background. Maybe you have a whole repository of your own ARM templates, and you want to know what the equivalent in Bicep is. Or maybe you downloaded an ARM template from the Azure portal or from a GitHub page, etc. You also have the option to decompile a JSON file back to Bicep, to start using Bicep from that moment on. So I have a Bicep file here, and that is cheating. Let me actually remove that. I have a JSON file here, and I could just simply say Bicep decompile, and then the name of the file, in this case, my JSON file. And left-hand side, you can see that we now have the Bicep equivalent of what we just created in our JSON file. So this allows us to do some reverse engineering to see how the syntax actually works, or to just simply transition all of your existing ARM templates back to Bicep. Do note that decompiling, as it says here, is at best effort. So it will be a valid Bicep file, but sometimes it might not be exactly the way you wanted it. So always make sure that you review what has been created to see if it actually is what you are about to, what you want to create. So a good example, of course, is the symbolic name. So the symbolic name doesn't exist in JSON, so it has to make that up. So in this case, it decided to make my symbolic name host name underscore resource. But if you would rather have that be HP, for example, just change that into the transpiled Bicep version. Last thing I want to show you about modules, and this is something that I also recently found out, I really want to share that with you, is using JSON files as a module file. So as you can see in this example, the same example as before, we have different Bicep files that we're using as a module inside our main. But I could also use an existing JSON template as a module file in my Bicep template. So I have a template here called 9oldschool-template.json. So if we would start to create a module registration, let's just call it test, and refer to that JSON template that we have before. I could do the equal sign, and similar to what Esther showed, here we have all the properties with the looping, the if, the required properties as well. So we even get the scaffolding option for existing JSON templates. Just hit enter here, and I'm now injecting in a JSON file as a module inside my Bicep file. So if you have existing JSON files you want to reuse for your Bicep templates, you not want to go over all of the transpiling back to Bicep files, you can just use them as a module inside your Bicep files, and even in between as well. So I can have Bicep files and JSON files in the same main file, both as a module being injected. So I was really happy to see that they decided to bring this in the product as well. Okay. And last thing I want to show you in this demo is a large-scale deployment of using all of the technology that we saw before, the stuff that Esther showed, and the for loops and all of the resource declarations inside a bigger deployment that's actually fully ready for production use. Before we do that, I'm not actively watching the chat window. Are there any questions we might want to address?
I would have interrupted you.
I know you would. But just taking to make sure. If there are questions, happy to answer those. So feel free to raise your hand or either set them in the chat window. That's totally fine. So let's move on to a bigger deployment, and that's example number 6 here. So again, we have a main.bicep file, which has all of our resource declarations and parameters, etc. And we have about 10 or 12 different module files. So this is similar to the ones we've seen before, but this time separate modules to create our Azure Virtual Desktop backplane, our networking components, our peering back to our Active Directory domain services, VNet, log analytics, monitoring, even things like the shared image gallery, image definitions, and all of that. So this is the main file. And again, we changed the target scope to subscription because in this case, we are deploying multiple resources into multiple resource groups. As we mentioned before, we have a couple of secure parameters that contain subscription IDs and passwords and such. And then there's a huge list of all kinds of parameters. And all of these parameters have default values. That's definitely not best practice to do that. But in this case, of course, it's for demo purposes to easily deploy this as a demo. But just to show you that they all have a default value for that reason. So let's scroll down to where we have the first resource declaration. And that is right here. So here we are creating our resource groups. So this is a declaration we have seen before. The resource keyword, the symbolic name, the resource group. And similar to the concatenations we've done before, this is a prefix and a postfix. And in the middle, we have the subject or the name of that resource group, what it actually contains. So one for networking, template images, backplanes, AVD hosts, etc. So this section right here will create about 10 or 12 different resource groups. Moving on to the actual resource declaration, or a couple of those. I'm not showing them all, of course, but here is again a declaration of an array of different Azure Virtual Desktop backplanes. The example we had before only contained 2 values, 2 parameters. In this case, we are allowing to define all of these values. So we can define the workspace name, the preferred application group type, the host pool type, the load balancer type, etc. So this is in this case, it's a variable, but it can also be a parameter, so you can easily change those values upon the deployment of this template as well. So these are 2 different Azure Virtual Desktop backplanes, and you might have guessed how we are going to use that inside a module. So we're using the keyword module with the symbolic name, referring to the file that contains the declaration of our Azure Virtual Desktop backplanes, and we're using that for loop again to loop through that array and do multiple additions of workspaces, application groups, and host pools based on what the array actually contains. So the rest of this Bicep file is just leveraging and using all of the existing modules on the left-hand side. So we're connecting to the network module to create a networking, monitoring for log analytics, our shared image gallery, and so on and so forth. So all of these modules here are used by this main file, allowing us to deploy an Azure Virtual Desktop deployment using a single Bicep file, essentially.
So Freek, we do have a question now. Woohoo!
Yes.
So Brian would like to know if there's a configuration item or a resource that is not supported by Bicep.
That's a great question, and the answer is actually no, there is not. And the reason is that Bicep has day zero support for all resources in Azure. So as soon as a new resource, new API version, a new update comes out for a resource provider or new resource, you instantly have access to that from Bicep as well as from ARM templates. So
yeah, so yeah, I was going to say Bicep is not using providers like some of the other tooling and methods are doing, which means that you are dependent on developers that add the new features or the new resources into a provider definition. Bicep uses Azure directly as its source, so that helps.
Yeah, but great question. Yeah, it's definitely a big plus for the Bicep as well as the ARM language for sure. Okay, any other questions before we move on?
Well, Francisco is saying or commenting that he says, hopefully at some point Bicep gets deletion, fail safe or state profiles, which is an interesting comment to make.
It is. Yeah, I was probably referring to other languages like, for example, Terraform, who do have state options like that. For Azure and for ARM templates, there is no state file. So to Bicep, Azure is the state. That has advantages because, well, you don't have to manage that state file separately because that becomes really super crucial for all of your deployments later on. But of course are also advantages of using such a state file for deleting or for maintaining deployments that you do. And we do know that Microsoft is working on something that they call deployment stacks. There's not too much information on that out there as yet, but it will allow you to do something similar with states and state files like for example, Terraform does.
Yeah, and if you're thinking about the usage that Terraform, for instance, does with the plan phase, where it shows you the differences or the changes it's going to make to the Azure resources, Bicep also supports the what if statement that ARM templates support. So that also gives you an option to do to have an overview of what the changes will be that are created or performed by the Bicep template.
Yeah. Okay. So the last thing I want to show you in this demo is actually deploying this to the Azure portal to to find out if it works or not. So this is always the fun part of the demo. And let's actually, before we do that, transpile it into a JSON file. So we'll do a Bicep build. And now my screen goes away. 1 second. Bicep build, and then the name of the file, in this case, 6main.bicep. So on the left-hand side, we get the JSON equivalent of that, and we also get a couple of warnings. These are the linter warnings that I also mentioned before. So this is the linter taking a look at your file and making sure that it's compliant to all the standards that are defined as part of the linter rules. And shame on me, I did not comply to all of my security standards. So yes, I am using hard-coded values for secure parameters inside this demo environment. So
only for demos. Do not try this in production.
No, do not do this. So we did actually create this JSON file on the left-hand side here. And so let's open it up. And we can actually see that it created a JSON file of, drum rolls, over 2,000 lines of code of JSON. So I'm not sure how you feel about this, but I would rather not have to create this from scratch in order to create all these objects that we're about to create. So what is the reason that it became so big? Obviously, for a part, it is because the syntax is much easier, less syntax overhead, etc. But also because once you transpile a Bicep file into a JSON file that has references to modules, it will also transpile all of the contents of all of the other Bicep files as well, joining them into one single JSON file. And that's the result that we're looking at right now. So that's the reason, one of the reasons that it's over 2,000 lines.
So it's basically translating your separate module files in kind of nested templates within one big JSON file.
Yep, that's exactly what happens. Yeah, so all the modules become nested deployments inside your main file. So without further ado, let's just, for the fun of it, deploy this to our Azure portal. And I have, let me just kick it off first. We can also see the end result. So what I do here is I use PowerShell, the new AZ deployment PowerShell commandlet, and I'm specifying as the template file the 6 main.json file. So this is the transpiled version of my Bicep file, the 2000 lines of code. I'm also passing a parameters file, which is also possible, similar to how ARM templates work. I can pass a specific parameters file containing values I want to override for the parameters. I give it a deployment name, and I give it, in this case, the West Europe location. So let's open up the Azure portal to also see the end result. So this is my Azure portal. Right now we have put in the Bicep as the search as a filter here. So there are 3 different resource groups. If I would do a refresh here, hopefully, and it works, we have the resource groups available here. So these are the resource groups that were just created by our deployment. That's not so much interesting, but in each of these resource groups, there has been 1 or more different additional deployments doing all of the resources that we defined inside our modules. So just to go over a couple of them real quick, we have, of course, our Azure Virtual Desktop environment. So we have different workspaces, host pools, and application groups. If I would go into one of these application groups, you can see that these are also tied together to make sure that everything works as part of this deployment. Not only that, but we also have the file services ready. So it also deployed 2 different storage accounts, one for my Azure Image Builder concept, one for my profile containers. So inside of here, I also have my file service and my profile containers share ready to go. I have a key vault being created to store those credentials and not have them as plain text values like I did in the deployment, of course. We have our monitoring, so this is ready to start using the Azure Virtual Desktop Insights to gather telemetry data about the environment. We have our networking being created, so a new VNet has been created, and inside of there we have 2 different subnets being created for our production and for our acceptance environment. And a whole lot more. So a lot of these components were just being created in the last couple of minutes or so. One thing I would also want to point out is it also deploys our template image structure. So it does also deploy the shared image gallery, makes a first version of template images and versions, etc., in order to use Azure Image Builder as our imaging technology going forward. So that was a real quick demo of the 2000 lines of code and what it resulted in the Azure portal. So you might not have all the time to actually see it finish, but hopefully you will trust me that it does. It takes about 3 minutes to complete. Last thing I want to show you before I hand it over to Esther, again, to show some other cool stuff as well, is you might want to also see this in action inside the visualizer. So since this is one of the bigger deployments, let's take a look at that to actually see what that looks like. Right click and open the visualizer. Let's do it full screen. You probably know why. So this is our deployment that was just being created in the last couple of minutes. So let's just zoom in. This is our shared image gallery, our networking. On top, we have our Azure Virtual Desktop monitoring, our template specifications, our key vaults, our production acceptance host pools and application groups, workspaces, etc. All nicely documented in this Bicep visualizer. So, Esther.
Yeah, do you want me to take
let's do that.
Controls back? I will share the slide deck again. Picking the right screen. So back to basically part 1 of our demo galore, so to speak. We also, I already pre-skipped to this slide, but we figured that even though this is already overwhelming on how to use Bicep and all the cool things that you can build with Bicep files, we wanted to make sure that in our presentation you also understand how you get your Bicep file template deployed in Azure. As Freek already showed, his method still is to transpile it to an JSON ARM template and then use PowerShell or Azure CLI to use that template to deploy the resources in Azure. There is, however, another cool way to do that. Because I've been focusing on GitHub Actions, I definitely wanted to share that with you as well, because I can imagine that those of us that are transitioning to more DevOps focused competences. It's also interesting to know that we can also use the Bicep templates directly in our deployments. So what am I talking about? Currently, there is still, as you can see, there are a lot of side notes or small prints to this statement. Currently, you can only deploy local Bicep files. So there's not yet an option, and I'm explicitly saying not yet, an option to reference, for instance, URLs or network shares to address centralized repository stored Bicep files. So in this case, you still have to make sure that on your Azure DevOps or GitHub Actions agent, you have those Bicep files locally available. But if you have that and you make sure that you have Azure CLI versus 2.20 or PowerShell 5.6 or newer, you can use the Bicep template file instead of your JSON template within the well-known commands. The other cool part is if we're using Azure CLI, you do not have to install Bicep yourself on your agent. Azure CLI can do that for you and will do that for you in the background, downloading the executable, installing it on the agent, and then using that to transpile your Bicep template to an ARM template in the background, while only for visible or only visible to you, basically just running the AZ command. If we're looking at PowerShell, I have to admit that PowerShell doesn't have that option yet. And I'm hopefully saying yes, yet. So with PowerShell, you have to make sure that Bicep is already installed locally and part of that path and variable. Because that allows PowerShell to use your Bicep executable to transpile in a similar way as the Azure CLI to transpile your Bicep template into a JSON template and use that to deploy your resources in Azure. The good news is a couple of months ago when we were doing this roadshow, I had to explain that unfortunately the Microsoft hosted agents did not yet have either Bicep installed by default or have the right versions for the AZ CLI or the PowerShell AZ module. The good news is that I double checked it just to make sure, but right now the Windows latest agent, which is based on Windows Server 2019, does have Bicep installed by default and also has the Azure CLI 2.20 and up, and the Azure PowerShell module, the AZ module 5.6 and up. So that makes life a lot easier. That means that previously when I wanted to deploy my Bicep template within Azure with a GitHub action, I still had to prep my agent to make sure that Bicep was downloaded and installed locally, and my Azure PowerShell module was updated to a supportable version. That no longer is needed because that all is in place in the agent. And that means that I don't need to create my own self-hosted agent or any other additional settings within my actions. So that means that I can only focus, in this case, I'm using a PowerShell action with an inline script, because for demo purposes, that's easier than referencing to external scripts, because I can directly show you what is being used within that script. So I'm using a template object. In this case, it's still showing some old content I see, because for the demo video, I created a smaller set. But basically, because Bicep doesn't have a parameters file, you can either use a JSON parameters file as input, because Bicep will accept that, because of course it is transpiled in the background to a JSON template, or you can use, in case of PowerShell, an object template parameter that allows you to easily define all the parameter values that you want to provide as input for your template, and use that in the new AZ, well, in my case, resource group deployment commandlet. As mentioned before, I'm just referencing the Bicep template file in this case. So I'm not transpiling it. I'm not referencing the JSON, the transpiled JSON file. I'm just using Bicep directly with the new AZ resource group deployment commandlet. And then, well, I'm not sure if we have enough time to show you the demo video, so I made sure that I had some screenshots in place. This is just showing you that I am referencing a locally stored template file, Bicep template file, which is basically the checkout of my repository, my GitHub repository, to the agent. And as you can see, the provisioning state is successful. And going back to Azure, which I'm not cool enough to do live, it shows you that the resources were created that were in the template. Do we have enough time, Jen, to do the video, or should I just move on quickly to the next slide?
Sure, you can go for it.
Okay, so this is the video that I recorded this afternoon to just quickly, let me just quickly get it started again. So this is just me showing you that there are no resources in my resource group within Azure. Always making sure that I didn't have any old data in there. Going back to GitHub Actions, where I have a YAML definition for the actions that I showed previously. In this case, it's run manually or triggered manually, just for demo purposes. Going through the basic first steps, setting up the job, checking out my repository files locally to the agent, and then zooming in on, in this case, my hello host pool Bicep file. That is my first attempt of creating a template for AVD host pool. And once again, zooming in on the YAML file that is being used for the GitHub action itself, doing the checkout that you saw previously, logging on to Azure to make sure that I can use the AZ PowerShell module, and as I mentioned, deploying the ARM resources with Bicep with the inline script. And this is just focusing on the script. Once again, just using less parameters this time, because I did get a bit smarter with the parameters and the prefix, using the prefix string. Just showing you that I'm using that Bicep template file and the new AZ resource group deployment commandlet. Once again, with the template files input and my template parameter object, because that makes, from my perspective, it more flexible than having a separate parameter file, because this allows me to script even more intelligence into the values for my parameters. Fortunately, with all the talking, the deployment is done. Scrolling down, you can see that the provisioning state indeed is succeeded. You can see the parameters and the values. In my case, I had a secure string password, so you see that that is definitely not shown, which is a good thing. And I defined an output of the host pool name, which it shows as well. So that means that my Bicep template was correctly transpiled in the background by the new AZ resource group deployment commandlet. And as you can see, it successfully created the resources in Azure.
Woohoo.
End of demo. So after all this excitement, there's even more excitement. We wanted to let you know or to give you a bit of insights into the roadmap for Bicep. As you can see at the beginning of the arrow with the version .1, .2, .3, and now we are already at .4. The team and the engineers have done an amazing job adding a lot of features and a lot of even basic or core settings into Bicep. So yeah, I for one am really amazed, and I did take the effort 2 nights ago to thank the team, because I know how much effort they put into it and how much it helps us to really use Bicep in production environments instead of having to wait for the version 1 that, as you can see, will be released end of year. So it's coming to you very soon.
Yeah, and the question we always get in this slide is, since the 0.1 version is coming later this year, does that mean that Bicep is not ready for production usage yet? That's definitely not the case. So since I think 0.3 version, it is ready for production use. There's full support from Microsoft as well. Just that they're constantly adding new features like the linter feature, the include files, and later on also the modules that can be private or publicly published. So yes, it's definitely ready for production use, although it's not a 1.0 version yet. It might sometimes be confusing.
No, but as you can see with the demo that Freek showed earlier, with all the modules, it is definitely ready for production, even for your AVD deployments, which usually are a bit more complex than the standard virtual machine deployments in Azure. And with that, I think we are almost at the end of our cool presentation. But we wanted to make sure that we are not just the only one giving feedback to the team, because the team loves to be very actively involved in GitHub, and they do respond very fast to any request that you may have or any bugs that you might report. If you want to dive into Bicep yourself, the best starting point is to go to aka.ms/bicep, which offers you the installation guides, tutorials, example code, and even some playgrounds. So you don't even have to download the executable and start running it on your own machine. You can definitely have some fun right away. And the other one that we definitely wanted to share with you is the aka.ms/learnbicep, because the team has been working very hard on making sure that there are different learn modules available for you to dive into Bicep and understand all the different concepts and the cool features that they have already added to the product. Anything you want to add, Freek?
No, I think that these are, like you said, the two starting points if you want to get started. Definitely the learning modules. They've been adding those over the last couple of weeks more and more as well. And they're also very interactive. So you get this sandbox machine temporarily to do some kind of action in Bicep. So yeah, definitely great resources to get started.
Yes, and that first URL directs you directly to the GitHub repository or the GitHub site that the team has. And I know Freek is already an active contributor, but if you we would love you to also contribute, even if it's just I was gonna say textual improvements. They still love that because they are very excited and very passionate about Bicep. So anything that they can learn from us, from field experience, they are I'm not going to say dying to hear that from you, but they are very eager to learn from our field experience. So do not be shy, reach out to the team, and let's make Bicep even more awesome. And on that note, I'm not going to share my hot dial button to Freek with you all, because I know he probably needs more time for more awesome books to write and other cool content to contribute to Bicep success. But I am going to leave you with, well, our social media details, and invite you to reach out with any questions that you may have, or any just brainstorming that you want to do with us. Feel free to reach out. We are very happy and excited to share our knowledge and experience with the community. And on that note, I definitely want to thank Jen for inviting us to this special episode or special meetup of the US Azure Virtual Desktop user group. It was our pleasure. I know we've kind of been nagging you for quite some months to have us. So we're very happy that we finally made it happen. So thanks for the opportunity. I hope you really enjoyed it. And if there are any more questions, just shoot in the chat or unmute yourself and ask freely.
Well, I want to thank you guys for this amazing session. I learned so much. It was fantastic. I do have the book, and I started, page 1, and it's on my to-do list to read as well. So it's great to have you here. And I did hear something about a question earlier, a challenge, or how is that going to work? Do we need to do that now, or you wanna?
Good question. Did you come up with a question in the meantime, Esther, or did you?
I didn't see that exciting questions or challenges in the chat yet. So to give you a bit of insight on that remark, in a previous roadshow, we did get a question. No, I'm not going to say what question we have, because you might just ask someone in the audience. But we did get a question that we didn't have an answer for right away. So what happened is, back then, Freek was doing all the demos. So that meant that I had time to quickly do some research of my own and add some slides on the fly to the deck, and surprise even Freek with an answer to some of the challenging questions that we had. But I guess today we need to turn the tables and turn the roles around, Freek. So I guess we need to find a challenging question for the audience to answer.
I just came up with a hopefully challenging question. So let's see. Are we going to allow the audience to do it in the chat window or via Twitter, or what would you prefer?
I'm okay with whatever you guys want to do.
Okay, let's just do the chat window and see who answers it first then. So the question is, we have seen a couple of different ways to transpile our Bicep templates into JSON templates. But there's one way we didn't show because that's not fully available yet. So if there's anyone who knows how to transpile a Bicep file into JSON using VS Code, answering the question in the chat right now, or just look it up later, and we'll see who's the first one who mentions this on Twitter or LinkedIn. So that's going to be the question.
All right. So I I will go first and say I don't know.
That's good, because you already have the book, right?
I'm gonna look it up over the weekend, but I'm gonna exclude myself from the list.
Okay.
So in the meantime, I'll use the rest of our time to go into some Terraform. So let's see. Hopefully you can see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Okay, and you see a presentation screen. Right. So this is the only slide I have, and Frank and Esther did such a good job about talking about the Visual Studio and infrastructure, and there's so much similarities. Only going to talk about the differences, and so hopefully that will make it go quick. In the meantime, I wanted to borrow something I got from Travis yesterday. If there could be a show of hands of folks that are using Terraform today in the chat, you could just raise your hand. Do I see any? Oh, yeah. What? Two? Okay, great. So I'm hoping you'll help me make it interactive and questions. And if someone could just interrupt me, it's fine. I prefer to be interrupted, and we could talk about it and go any direction. So we'll go straight into a demo at the beginning, because I'm going to try to do this live demo. And along the way, we'll talk about the little basics and how it applies to AVD. So let me, and oh, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Jen. I've been working in infrastructure for over a decade in user compute space. I'm not a coder, so I come from the perspective of an infrastructure engineer. I don't know it all, and but I appreciate infrastructure as code and the benefits, and been using Terraform for over a year now. And today, I started with Terraform because I was doing consulting and I used multiple environments. Today, I work for Microsoft as an Azure Fast Track engineer, and I work with a lot of smart people. So if I don't have the answer for you, I'm sure I could find out if we have questions that I can't answer. So let's, oh, and socials below if you want to get contact with me. It's very easy. Okay, so I will get rid of PowerPoint here. And a second, I don't want to kill resources. Okay, so just to set the stage, this is a very easy AVD deployment. I've done some other presentations in the past, have a GitHub repo with some modules similar to what Frank and Esther was talking about. But this is just simple to get you started if you're just trying to learn Terraform and get some of the basics. So if you notice on the left, I'm using Visual Studio. It's my favorite, and it has some of the cool IntelliSense like you saw with Bicep. It doesn't always work right, but it does make life easier. I have these TF files, which Terraform reads, but I want you to notice something. So I'm going to, the first thing I need to do is I need to tell Terraform to initialize my directory. So I'm going to do initialize, and you'll see it's initializing my backend, and it's going to go out and seek all the providers that I need for my code, install them if I don't have them. So let's make this a little bit bigger so you can see. So here you see that I had an Azure RM match and a time that I'm using and an Azure read. So the other thing that this did is it created this .terraform folder. If I expand that, you'll see it installed my providers that I needed and created this Terraform log. So before I move on, let's just take a look at Terraform documentation here for a second. So if I go to Terraform IO website and I click on registry and I look at browse providers, you can see that there are tons of providers here. There's a huge list. So in this case, I'm using Azure. So I'll go here. And this is the, oh, wow, they just updated like 15 hours ago. I swear that said 2.70 yesterday. So here, a lot of times when they're starting out, you may not know all the items that is covered. So there is a documentation link here. And if you go here, there is this filter that you can search pretty much on anything. So if you wanted to search on compute, you could do that and just sort of pick out what you want. And here, there are examples. So this is an example that you could copy in and use your code. So that's one way. So let's go back a little bit before we go back. So if you notice down here, there are some modules. So there are already pre-written modules in the, if you would equivalent this to, I heard somebody call it marketplace. So it's the Terraform marketplace, if you will, of modules. And this one is actually a really good one if you're just getting started. The Cloud Adoption Framework has a huge amount of pretty much everything you want to build, your landing zones, and this one is updated frequently. And as you can see, tons and tons of good stuff here. So if my motto, don't reinvent the wheel. If it's there and it works, absolutely use it. So there's that. So let's go back to getting my code going. So before we start going any further, let me just go ahead and do apply so I can kick off my deployment. So if you notice, when I hit enter, a couple of new files popped up. So I got a terraform.tf state. And we were chatting about this earlier about Bicep having its state managed by Azure. Well, Terraform has its own state file. And this is one of the things that allows us to destroy. Terraform has a destroy command and also maintain changes. So if you look here, you'll see that I have a lot of green pluses because I don't have anything in this subscription. And actually, I should show you that real quick. Hang on. Let's go back to my portal. OK, so my environment here, the demo environment with Visual Studio. All I have in here is this one resource group that has a domain controller and it's in its own VNet and a client. So it's just a Windows server, two Windows servers, domain controller, has AD Connect that is syncing my users to Azure so that I can simulate being on premises in a hybrid instance. So these resource groups are empty, just to show you, I have nothing there. This I mentioned real quickly. This is for the CAF that I showed you before. This basically has a rover, and I'll talk a little bit about this. So one of the things that we have with state, I am using Terraform locally on my laptop, and my state file is for this demo purposes on my laptop, and only I have access to it. But if I want to make changes and share it with my other team members, they can't change it because they don't have the state file, right? So in order to do that, you have to figure out a way to share the state file. the state file usually is in, and it's for demo purposes only on my laptop. Usually you would put this in a storage location like blob. It's encrypted at rest, so you don't have to worry about security unless you have more security constraints. You could do some other things. But I also have this DevOps VM that I have my versions and everything here. So this is like a shared VM that you could use to deploy and not have to worry about, you know, being able to not have the state file shared. So let's go right back here. Thought I was seeing something on the chat. Sorry, I got distracted. So I have nothing, so I'm going to add all these items. So this is a lot, right? If you notice, it took a minute before this all got processed because these are all the files. So I don't have to separate out my file. I could have everything in just one main.tf file. But Terraform automatically knows to concatenate all the files into one, and it will order things as it needs to. It reads it all, similar to Bicep, so that's nothing new. We've heard about that already. So I'm going to go ahead and say yes here because I think we'll run out of time, right? And it will start deploying. And so while that's deploying, we'll just start looking at the code. So let's look at the main. So as you know, we need more than just Azure Virtual Desktop Hub deployed, right? It's more than just a workspace, a desktop application group, and a host pool. We also need the supporting items. So for ease, these were separated out with the names. So we have starting with the storage account. And here I'm separating out the resource group for the storage. So I'm putting the storage account in its own resource. So let's look at this syntax for a bit. So this syntax here, and if I hover over, you can see that IntelliSense will give me some feedback here. So this is the name that comes from the Azure RM provider. This is how Terraform knows that I am creating a resource group, right? The name here, this name, is just a reference, and it's only used by Terraform. Has nothing to do with the portal, nothing to do with what's created in Azure. These items down here, the location, tells me that I'm going to create it in East US, and I'm giving it a name. And in this case, AF-storage RG. So this is the most simplistic way to do it, where I actually hard-coded the location and the name of the resource. Okay, so remember I said that there were other providers that I could use. So I'm using the random provider to generate a random string because you may know that Azure Storage needs to be a unique name. And in order to make sure that my name is unique to Azure, I'm going to have my name be store and use the random string to give me a unique name. And then if you notice here, the resource group name, I did something a little bit different. Up here, I had this reference as RG_storage. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying use the Azure RM resource group .rg storage name. So whatever this name is here, it's going to fill it out here, and the same with the location. Now, when I do it that way, it's dependency mapping, right? It means that the storage account needs to know that that resource group was created already before I can actually have the storage account created, because I need the resource group first, right? So I'm giving it the limited parameters of premium, LRS, and supply storage. There's tons more settings that you could put in there, but I don't need to. I just wanted to make sure I had a file storage, and that hence I set just what I needed. The file share I'm creating here for FS Logic, and notice the depends on tells you at, and I just realized that I started with storage like Esther wanted to. Tells that I can't have my file share created until I have my storage account, right? Makes sense. So there's a use of the depends room. And a little bit lower down here, I'm actually setting up my RBAC. So up until now, we've been using resource to do all our creations. Here, we're introducing another syntax, data. So the data block actually is more of a lookup, if you will. So it's going to go out and look for Azure RM role definition and find that storage file data SMB share contributor. And then once I have that, now I can go ahead and set that based on my storage ID and say, give this permission, this group. And here I'm also using a Azure read to pick up my group, my AD group, and set that permission. So my Azure Virtual Desktop users are in a group already predefined, and that group will now have rights to my storage, right? So still going, see if we can make it. I'm going to go through this one. So we need a session host, right? We need to have something in our host pool. And so here we're doing as a simple creating two. Obviously we can change it, but just doing a RDS count to set how many. I have variables that are referenced here. So our variables are slightly different, but similar concept to, I think the parameters, was it that you called it? Yeah. And the big no-no that I'm doing is I'm actually, I cheated. I didn't want to type any of this stuff with you guys. So I just went ahead and wrote everything out to equal. So I have a TF vars file that has all my settings ahead of time. If I didn't do this, what would happen was when I hit yes, it would be prompted and I would have to actually manually type it in. And obviously this is, don't do this at home. Don't put your passwords out there. I think I did put in here that it was a secure, a reference to secure string somewhere here. Oh yes, sensitive true. This command sets it so it's true. But again, you would have your state in a secure location and not put any of this stuff out there, right? So let's go back to our session host. You can see I'm doing addition to, we have my NIC here, and because we're doing multiple, we have the count index here to add the second one. And we have a private IP. We have the depends on to make sure we have everything that we need ahead of time. So here we're building the virtual machine, setting our storage, getting it from the marketplace, get the SKU of what we want, and then again, making sure we have the right dependencies. And here we're actually doing a little bit of the DS extensions to make sure we can join those VMs to the domain. So here's all the settings for that, and then accommodating further down here the addition to the host pool. So all of this is dependent on having that host pool created and obviously the domain joined, right? So this code, I will say I had some help with this. I'm just reading some of the comments. So I've been collaborating with another fast track engineer to get this code out so that we can put this in the official repo where currently it's only the classic version for WVD. And we collaborated on this, and we're hoping to have this out soon. So it's probably coming that you're going to ask me for the code, and very, very soon it will be coming with a blog article. And I would love feedback if you have any while I'm doing this right now. So if I can make it better, please let me know.
You're already killing it, Jen.
Thank you. So here the network, remember I said I had one VNet for my domain controller. Here I'm doing a peering with a separate VNet for, in the same subscription, a separate VNet for my AVD. So I have a sort of hub and spoke model, and peering has to happen obviously for the communication. These are just some outputs. So when the deployment is finished, I can get some feedback when things that I might need. And I didn't talk about the provider. I did talk about the providers, but this is the syntax here. And the one thing I want to point out is, if you notice, I just said 2.0 here. But I got the 2.71, the new one that just got released 15 hours ago when I did my init, because this little tilde tells that I can take everything after the rightmost number. So the 0, whatever that.
So you're taking the major version, the latest minor of the major.
Correct. Exactly. Thank you. And here we go. Some good stuff here with the RBAC. So in order to permission so once I have this all deployed, my AVD users need permission to the desktop, right? They need to be permissioned with the desktop virtualization role. And so this is how this all happens. We're using the Azure read, and I'm not sure, but I don't think that you can do this in Bicep yet. Like, you can't do a read, right? And you can correct me if I'm wrong. Freek is still there, right?
I'm still there. Yeah, you're correct.
Yeah, I didn't want to answer that one, but yeah.
So this is another pro of Terraform that.
But it's not a competition, Jen. It's not a competition.
No, not at all. I think we can. We should have just taken the roadshow to make it Bicep/Terraform, right? So we could do the pros and cons together.
You saw there's enough space in the interior, and we'll get the refreshments right. No worries.
Okay. So the Azure read does a check for the users, and note that if they're not there, it will complain and you will not be able to do anything, right? And it does the group checks and assigns the virtual desktop user. So, here we go. It's finished. Wow, that was quick. Or did I get an error? Looks good. Okay, let's go look in the portal and see what we got. If I can find us. Here we go. So I'm going to go back to resource groups and do a little refresh here. Okay, here's my storage account. And I should now have a file share. Yes, FSLogix, right?
Check.
And if I go to role assignments, drum roll, here's my AVD users. Storage, file, data, SMB, right? Okay.
Nice.
Okay, so let's go back to AVD resource group, the other resource group that was created. Here are all my resources. So my AVD and the 2 VMs that were created and the VNet. So here's my VNet, and I have it peered to my infrastructure network, right? Subnet. Nice. Okay, so, and then they are all running, yes. So if we have enough time, we do. Let's try to do this real quick. See. Sure. That should be the right user. Oh yeah, okay. Let's see if this works. There's my desktop. And woohoo! Live demo.
Nice.
And
Very
it
cool.
works. Okay, so one of the things that it did not do, because even though I'm using Azure Files for my storage, I don't have a method with Terraform to set my NTFS permissions and join Azure Files to Active Directory domain. So that's still something I need to do. So FFLogix will not work properly here. It's installed, it will load, but I don't have that part set up. So that's a manual step that you will need to do. And one thing, is there any questions? I'm not sure I'm keeping up with the chat.
No, they're just creating some competitive goals for Freek and I to make sure that we will keep up with Terraform.
Oh, okay, cool. The other thing, I know we were talking about this in the chat a lot. So I could just as easily do a destroy here, and or changes, right? It's one of the things you can absolutely do changes. If I made a change, it would state maintains the change and only that change would happen. And I can also do a destroy, right? And destroy it all.
But that
So
destroy uses your state file to figure out what it needs to destroy. Or does it destroy everything in Azure?
it does use the state file. So if it's not in state, so here you see it will give you a readout of what it's going to destroy. So I highly recommend reading before saying yes. The red, minus signs means it's going to destroy it. The one thing I will say about this particular code, because it's appearing on the network, there may be sometimes you could have a failure with the destroy where you're destroying and the subnet still has the resources associated to it. So the NIC is still associated to the resource. That's just an Azure thing, not really a Terraform thing. But you could have that happen where you'd have to go and manually destroy it from the portal if that occurred. It's purely a timing thing. So that was it. I think, is there questions? I'm looking. Feedback, comments?
A lot of applause and a lot of cheering, Jen.
Oh, thank you. So is there anything you would like to see? And if you don't have a question now, maybe later, please hit me up on Twitter or LinkedIn. I think everybody knows my email address now.
Yeah, we're just going to ask you for the code. You know how we are.
Right. And it will be coming. I promise. I'm just waiting for the repo to get created. And again, my friend Emily McLaurin in the UK helped with some of this, so I can't take the full credit for the code. Yes, there will be. You can do a Git pull, and absolutely. And so that was all I had, and I think we only have 2 more minutes. So did anybody come up with the answer that you guys were looking for?
Yes.